He is squatting 315 pounds for 15 repetitions, at over 70 years old, and his legs still look like they belong to a man half his age. For decades, one image has defined an entire sport, a pair of quadriceps, so deep and so striated that they earned their own nickname, the Quadfather. It was not simply great legs or impressive legs, it became a title, a legend built on two limbs. Before those legs became the most famous in bodybuilding history, they nearly did not get the chance to exist at all. Tom Platz's leg story does not start with strength, it starts with pain. As a teenager, he was not the kid with freak genetics blowing past everyone in the gym. He had a real back problem, the kind that made basic squatting feel like a gamble every time the bar touched his shoulders. Most people in that position quietly avoid the exercise for the rest of their lives, but Platz did not have that option. It was not fearlessness that kept him in the rack. It was a stubbornness that would eventually reshape an entire training philosophy. He forced himself back into the squat rack one cautious rep at a time, learning proper mechanics from people around him who understood the lift. What started as damage control turned into obsession, and that obsession, given enough years, turned into the most feared leg day in bodybuilding history. The man whose legs became untouchable started as the guy whose back nearly took squatting away from him completely. His obsession started earlier than most people realize. He was 9 years old when he saw a poster of bodybuilder Dave Draper, and decided that this was going to be his life. His father did not dismiss it as a passing phase. He leaned into it, reading workout routines out loud to him in the basement, and turning the whole thing into a family project. His younger siblings would sit there counting his reps out loud, which is how they learned to count in the first place. Long before the Quadfather existed as a nickname, there was just a kid in a basement, obsessed with an idea most 9-year-olds forget by lunchtime. By the time he was a teenager training seriously, he was no longer just doing leg day to keep up with everyone else. He was chasing something nobody else in the gym seemed to want. At a time when most lifters treated the squat rack like an afterthought, worried it would thicken their waist and throw off the proportions they were chasing, Platz went the opposite direction and leaned all the way in. While other bodybuilders tiptoed around heavy leg work to protect their look, Platz decided his legs were going to be the look. That decision moved with him all the way to California. In 1997, he landed in Venice with $50 in his pocket, and one destination in mind: Gold's Gym. The same gym in the same era as Arnold Schwarzenegger. At the exact moment bodybuilding was becoming a global spectacle. Most guys who show up broke with a dream get swallowed by a place like that. But Platz got noticed, and it was his legs that did the talking before he'd said a word. By then, the numbers had become extraordinary. He performed 23 reps with 545 pounds on a full squat, not a partial rep or a quarter squat ego lift, but a real, deep, brutal squat repeated 23 times, with more weight than most serious lifters will ever put on their back for a single rep in their life. That number still gets repeated in gyms today. It is the standard he set, and it remains a standard almost nobody has matched since. Platz didn't train legs like a powerlifter chasing a number and walking away. He trained them like an artist chasing detail, using forced reps, drop sets, and partial reps stacked at the bottom of brutal, grinding sets, with long time under tension that turned a single set into a test of will as much as muscle. He wasn't just building size, he was sculpting separation and striations, a level of quad development that looked less like muscle and more like anatomy diagrams brought to life. Anyone who trained legs seriously in that era will say the same thing. Tom Platz didn't have a leg day. He had a leg event, something other lifters would show up just to watch. Because what he was doing to his body in that hour looked less like exercise and more like a controlled demolition. With legs that good, with a physique that unique, he never won the biggest title in the sport. He never took home Mr. Olympia. His best finish, third place in 1981, remains one of the most debated results in bodybuilding history. To a lot of fans, it never made sense that the man with the most jaw-dropping leg development anyone had ever seen didn't walk away with the top prize. Judging in that era rewarded a certain proportional ideal, an overall package where every body part matched every other body part in scale. Platz's legs were so far ahead of the rest of his physique, so dominant in the room, that some judges saw imbalance where fans saw greatness. His upper body was excellent by any normal standard. It simply wasn't a fair fight against what his legs had become. The crowd got a legend, the judges' scorecards got an asterisk, and Platz got a reputation that outlasted every man who beat him. His legs still come up in conversation decades after his last competition, while plenty of Mr. Olympia winners from the same years have faded from casual conversation entirely. Trophies get updated every year. Legendary body parts don't. Their reputation extended beyond his final Mr. Olympia appearance, into some of the more unusual chapters in the sport's history. In 1990, Platz stood at the closing ceremony of that year's Mr. Olympia, not as a competitor, but to help announce the launch of the World Bodybuilding Federation, alongside Vince McMahon. The WBF was an attempt to pull bodybuilding out of its existing organizations and remake it as a scripted WWE-style spectacle. It did not last, folding within a couple of years, but the fact that Platz was attached to the announcement at all indicated how much weight his name carried by that point. Bodybuilding's biggest promoter did not choose just any retired competitor to stand beside him for that announcement. He chose the athlete whose legs people still talked about. Then there is the squat-off. In 1992, Platz competed against Fred Hatfield, known as Dr. Squat in Essen, Germany, in a competition built around one measure: who could handle more weight and more reps on a single lift. The format ran in 2 phases: a maximum single lift test, followed by a set at 525 pounds for as many reps as each man could complete. It was not scripted, unlike the WBF venture. It was 2 of the most respected squatters in the sport, in the same room, settling a comparison fans had debated for years. Most casual bodybuilding fans are not aware of it. Those who are still describe it in detail, characterizing it less as an exhibition and more as 2 established figures resolving a long-standing argument within the sport. The intensity behind that training extended beyond the physical. Platz has spoken about the mental discipline required to push a leg workout beyond the point most people would stop. He has described looking in the mirror mid-workout and treating his own past performances as a standard he needed to surpass each time he trained. He was not chasing another athlete's numbers, but his own, aiming to outperform his previous sessions. That approach is part of why his leg training remains a reference point for those studying lower body development, even decades later. It was not only the loads he moved, but his refusal to end a set once it became difficult. Platz has described how demanding that mindset was, noting that its effects extended beyond the training sessions themselves. By his account, it shaped how he approached his day, how he spent time outside the gym, and how much time he devoted to socializing, since the training required a high level of focus. He has said it was not sustainable as a casual pursuit, describing it instead as a significant psychological commitment. He has stated that progress in training comes from working through discomfort rather than avoiding it. Where most references to no pain, no gain repeat a slogan, Platz was describing his actual daily routine. That level of commitment is a primary reason his legs became a reference point for a later generation of bodybuilders. Athletes who never competed against him, including some born after his Mr. Olympia years, grew up associating his name with a specific standard for leg training. Programs built around drop sets, forced reps, and high-volume squat work are still compared to his methods, whether or not those following them know the origin. Few athletes in any sport have had their name become shorthand for an entire training philosophy. Platz did, largely because of one body part, a degree of specificity uncommon in a sport that typically rewards the complete package over any single feature. At 70 years old, Platz was still squatting 315 pounds for 15 reps. Not 15 years ago, and not from an old training log people quote from memory recently. When asked how a man in his 70s is still loading a barbell like that without his knees breaking down, his answer isn't about supplements or shortcuts, it's about technique. He has stated that he has never had a real knee problem in his life, and he credits that directly to how precisely he learned to squat real depth, real control, none of the shortcuts that wear down joints over decades of training. A man who spent years training legs harder than almost anyone in bodybuilding history. Deep squats, brutal volume, partial reps stacked on partial reps did not have that intensity destroy his joints. The precision behind it may be exactly what preserved them, which runs counter to the usual warning given about heavy squatting. It also complicates an assumption many people hold by default, that extreme training in your 20s and 30s functions as a loan against your knees and hips later in life. Platz's own body doesn't fit that assumption cleanly. He didn't train light as he got older to protect himself from decades of heavy squatting. He kept squatting real weight, for real reps, deep into his 70s, and points to the same technical foundation he built as a teenager, after being forced back into the squat rack following an injury, as the reason it never broke down. Whether that holds up as a broader lesson for anyone else is debatable, but as a single data point from one of the most extreme squatters the sport has produced, it is a hard one to dismiss. Part of his story has nothing to do with strength, and it is worth noting because it shows a different side of the same discipline. Platz went public about dealing with Bell's palsy, a condition that can cause sudden facial weakness and drooping, often triggered by a viral infection. He did not avoid questions about it or disappear from public view. He addressed it directly, discussed the adjustments he was making, and kept showing up. It is a small part of his story, but it reflects the same directness that led him to speak openly about training and steroid use in an era when most people in the sport avoided the subject entirely. Behind the training volume was an equally serious approach to fueling it. Standing 5'8" but carrying well over 200 pounds of mostly muscle meant Platz could not simply train hard and hope for the best. He had to eat accordingly because his body demanded it. Mornings started with whole grain toast, juice, and coffee. After training, the real intake began. Several eggs, a hamburger patty, sliced tomatoes, more bread, and more juice. Dinner was built around a large prime rib salad with cottage cheese and nuts, bread and butter, and a piece of pie or a scoop of ice cream. Evening snacks consisted of a couple of pints of ice cream or a bag of nuts. It was not a modern, clean-eating bodybuilding diet. It was high-calorie fuel for a body that was breaking itself down in the gym every day and needed enough raw material to rebuild. On the subject of steroid use, Platz has also been candid. He has stated that his own use during competition was minimal by the standards of the era. A couple of compounds, nothing exotic, no testosterone, no designer drugs, and that his focus was on long-term health rather than short-term maximum size. This stands in contrast to modern bodybuilding, where doses have increased substantially and the sport has seen a number of early deaths among competitors in recent years. Platz's approach offers a possible explanation for why he is still squatting real weight for real reps in his 70s, while many who came after him are not. What made those legs what they were comes down to a handful of factors. Genuine mechanical mastery of the squat, developed out of necessity after a back injury, forced him to learn it properly. A willingness to prioritize a body part most others in his era were avoiding. Volume and intensity that bordered on extreme, applied with enough technical precision that it did not damage his joints the way it would have damaged most others, and an approach that treated every set as a direct measure against his own past performance. This is what the Quadfather refers to, beyond the nickname. It describes a man who turned a physical weakness into the defining strength of his career, did not win the sport's biggest title despite that dominant asset, and decades later still demonstrates that the foundation he built was never tied to a single competition. The Mr. Olympia title went to other competitors that year. His legs entered bodybuilding history on their own terms. The sport has changed significantly since Platz built that reputation, which puts his numbers into sharper context. Modern bodybuilders train with access to nutrition science, recovery tools, and by his own account, heavier protocols than what he used during his competitive years. Yet the reference point for the best legs bodybuilding has produced still traces back to a competitor from the late 70s and early 80s, working with a fraction of today's resources. It is a notable outcome for a sport in which nearly every other measurable category has been surpassed over time, while this particular measure has remained largely unchanged. Platz did not leave the sport once the competitive wins stopped. He moved into teaching, decades of seminars, talks, and one-on-one coaching, passing on the mechanics that allowed him to squat as he did without damaging his joints. He has worked with newer competitors seeking the kind of leg development that has not been matched since his era, treating his own training history as a technical reference rather than a retrospective. His training routines continue to circulate in gyms as reference material for anyone serious about squatting, not out of nostalgia, but because the technical approach still holds up. His legs even followed him onto film sets. During and after his competitive years, Platz picked up small roles that leaned directly on his physique. A bodybuilder character here, a background muscle-bound presence there, including an appearance in the movie Twins alongside two of the most recognizable names bodybuilding ever produced in Hollywood. He was never chasing an acting career for its own sake. Directors wanted him in frame for the exact same reason fans still bring him up decades later, because there was nothing else in the room that looked like him. That's the part of the story that separates him from most. Where are they now bodybuilding features? He's not a guy who peaked in the 80s and spent the following decades talking about it. He's still in the gym, still coaching, still, by his own account, treating every training session like a confrontation with his own past standards rather than a victory lap. And at 70 plus years old, still loading real plates onto a real bar, joints intact, technique unchanged, Tom Platz isn't just a memory of what his legs used to be. He's living proof of what they still are. A body of evidence, quite literally, that some records aren't broken because they were never really about a number in the first place.